This video is sponsored by Squarespace. This is one of the smallest and lightest interchangeable lens cameras that Sony has ever made, which means that when paired with an equally small lens, this has the potential to be an incredibly portable travel or street photography camera. It also happens to be one of the cheapest Sony options you can currently buy right now, and this particular copy cost me just £61 in excellent condition, though in the US they tend to fetch prices around about the $100 mark. But seeing as this was first released all the way back in 2011, is this seriously a camera worth considering 13 years later in 2024? Well, this is the Sony NEX-C3, and it was the third mirrorless camera Sony ever released, following on from its predecessors, the original NEX-5 and NEX-3, which were both released a year before this one. As its name hints at, this is the successor to the NEX-3, and this particular model saw a number of slight improvements over its ancestor to make it the slightly more attractive option of the two. One of the biggest changes being a 72-gram reduction in weight, which I admit in isolation doesn't sound all that significant, but when you consider that the original NEX-3 weighed just under 300 grams, that means somehow Sony managed to shave off a quarter of its mass without losing any features, as this model comes in at a featherweight 225 grams. This in turn, as I've already mentioned, makes this one of the lightest and smallest Sony cameras you can buy, even to this day. Now, after handling this camera for the first time, I did get a big hint as to how Sony managed to achieve such a dramatic weight loss without sacrificing any core features, and that's because this does feel very plasticky in the hand. But that's not to say that it feels poor quality. In fact, it actually feels relatively solid. And seeing as so many of these cameras are still live and kicking today after almost a decade, it suggests to me that this camera is still tough enough to stand the test of time. But before I dive too deeply into the nitty-gritty of things like build and handling, I do need to preface this whole section by saying that this is by no means the most outstanding camera that I have ever used. Because let's be honest, this is an 11-year-old piece of tech that was born at the very dawn of the mirrorless camera age, and the fact that you can buy this camera for less than $100 these days should say everything you need to know. However, just because it isn't the best camera ever built does not mean that it doesn't come with a number of positives, particularly for newcomers to photography or those looking for a cheap portable camera for casual types of photography work. But we'll cover some of these plus points a little later on. For now though, here are some of the things you need to be made aware of before considering a camera like this. Firstly, its small size is both a blessing and a curse. Now obviously the smaller frame and super low weight are certainly traits that are well suited towards travel and street photography, where you need something discreet and pocketable that you could easily carry around with you all day long. However, the compromise to this is that naturally the smaller frame means that there is less room for manual buttons and dials, and therefore you do need to do a bit of menu diving in order to find some of the settings you're looking for. Now, although the menu system does look a little bit dated, actually I found that it was fairly easy to navigate, as there isn't an overly extensive list of options like you see on most modern cameras these days. The only issue is that as this is an older camera, it was made way before the days where touchscreen became the norm, so navigating the menu system has to be done using this small D-pad on the back, which for people like me who have baseball mitts for hands, it can be a little bit fiddly to use, especially considering that the front hand grip is fairly shallow and made from a slippery plastic, which definitely doesn't help matters. But one thing I think Sony really got right with these first wave of small cameras is the level of customizability. Now you'll notice that most of the buttons on this thing have not actually been labeled, and this was done intentionally because if you go into the settings menu, you can actually adjust the functionality of most of these buttons to suit your very own shooting style. What's more, for newbies, there's actually a bunch of pop-up tips that help to better explain what some of the advanced features and functions do, though this can be deactivated for more experienced shooters because the pop-up tips can get a bit annoying after a while. And there's also a pretty extensive beginner's guide to photography covering most of the basic principles built into the actual camera. Funnily enough, whoever owned this camera before I did actually customized this bottom button down here to allow quick access to this guide on the fly, which I thought was actually a pretty smart idea. Now, returning to the exterior of the camera, the top plate is actually pretty sparse in terms of controls, with only space for a shutter button, the on-off switch, and rather strangely, the playback button. I'm assuming it's up here because they simply ran out of space to put it anywhere else, so they thought, there will do. Although there's no physical mode dial, this can be adjusted on the screen via the settings menu, or if you tend to switch through the MSAP shooting modes quite frequently, you could even set one of the buttons on the back to act as a shortcut. There's obviously no room for a pop-up flash or a full-size hot shoe port, though there is this small port on the top here for attaching peripheral devices, and the camera that I bought actually came included with this small flash attachment, which I guess could be handy in a pinch. Now, speaking of peripherals, although there isn't an EVF on this camera, you can actually buy an optical viewfinder that clips into the top here called the FDA SV-E1, which isn't perfect but better than nothing for those who simply cannot live without a viewfinder. Luckily though, the screen on the back here is actually pretty large and is able to pull out and tilt to help with shooting at high or low angles. Now, for most types of candid photography like street and travel, I actually personally prefer to use the screen over an EVF because it means that I can shoot way more discreetly from the hip and minimize the chances of drawing attention to myself, but you know, that's just me. However, one of the strangest quirks about this camera has to be the fact that the SD card isn't located in the battery compartment next to the battery, but instead it has its own storage compartment right next door to it. Unfortunately though, this also means that it's right next to the tripod thread, which means that as soon as you mount this to a tripod, this hatch becomes completely inaccessible, which I'm sure has pissed off countless landscape photographers over the years. But design gripes aside, I did mention at the start of this video that this model saw some technical upgrades over its predecessor, so what exactly is hiding inside this camera? But before I can do that, I quickly need to talk about today's sponsor, and that's Squarespace. Whether you're a total newbie or a seasoned veteran, every photographer needs a high quality website to showcase their work, and I've personally been using Squarespace to build and host a number of websites over the years, including the ones for my wedding photography business and my media company. And that's largely because I have next to no experience building websites, but with the huge range of templates to choose from and its simple drag and drop interface, it's never been easier to create a professional looking website in just a matter of minutes. So if you want to get started, simply head over to squarespace.com/Tom Calton and save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain using the code Tom Calton. And thank you once again to Squarespace for sponsoring this episode and supporting the channel. Well, despite being such a small camera, it still manages to house a 16.2 megapixel APS-C size sensor, which saw a slight increase in terms of pixel count compared to the 14 megapixel chip on the original NX3. With this sensor, the camera is able to churn out raw photos at up to 5.5 frames per second using a proper mechanical shutter. Though do bear in mind that this is an old entry-level camera, so don't expect to be able to capture too many raw files before the buffer fills and grinds everything to a halt. Now, just like most of Sony's lower tier APS-C options, there's no IBIS on this camera either, though I did find a fairly affordable workaround to this, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. Anyway, I think a major strength to using Sony cameras, old or new, is how future-proof they are. For example, Sony tends to use the same types of batteries across most of their mirrorless range. To my memory, they've only ever used 2 different styles of battery in the 14 years they've been making mirrorless cameras. Now, these older and smaller cameras tend to use the NP FW50 type of batteries, and because so many camera models use this style of battery, it means that you can find replacements very easily online, with third-party versions being pretty affordable. What's more, all Sony mirrorless cameras use the same Sony E-lens mount, so the lenses you buy for this camera will work on any other Sony mirrorless camera that you may decide to upgrade to in the future, whether that's another APS-C size body like this or full frame. Now, speaking of lenses, there's a huge selection of lenses available for this Sony E-mount system online, as Sony decided to open their gates to third-party manufacturers very early on in their mirrorless journey, unlike some of the brands who have maybe been a little bit late to respond. Canon. And this means that there are a ton of options to choose from at varying price points to suit just about any kind of budget. Now, when I was shopping for a lens to pair with this camera, I wanted to pick something that was fairly cheap, but also one with a slim profile to help keep this setup as lightweight and pocketable as possible. And eventually I settled on this 16 to 50mm f3.5 to 5.6 power zoom, as it pretty much ticks all of the boxes. It's small, lightweight, relatively slimline in design, but most importantly, you can pick these up for around 80 to 90 pounds here in the UK, or for a little over $90 in the US. Now, if you're not familiar with power zooms, essentially they just allow you to adjust the focal length using this little electronic rocker switch on the side here, rather than having to use a traditional zoom ring which you have to physically twist. My understanding is that traditionally, I believe these types of lenses were built with the intention of being used with video capture so that you can smoothly zoom in and out whilst recording. However, as we'll see a little bit later on, recording video on this camera isn't something you'll want to do probably ever. But actually, I believe this power zoom design also lends itself nicely to candid styles of photography too, as it means you can quickly and quietly zoom in and out with a subtle flick of your thumb. And obviously, this is going to draw way less attention to yourself than having to twist your wrist backwards and forwards like you have to do with a traditional zoom lens. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this camera doesn't have IBIS. However, this zoom offers optical steady shot, which is a form of in-lens stabilization and is able to help you gain shake-free shots while shooting handheld. In terms of autofocus, obviously this isn't going to be the fastest camera in the world, as it uses a rather dated contrast detect AF system. However, I've got to say I found that it's still plenty fast enough for most types of photography where you don't need to track fast-moving subjects. It also offers a very basic form of face detection AF, which works well enough, so overall I really can't complain all that much. But an area where I can complain is the video mode. Now, if you are planning on buying this camera with the hopes of using it for video work too, then I hate to break it to you, but this is not the one for you. To put it simply, the video settings on this are very outdated, with it offering a choice of 720p or VGA video. That's it. There's no manual exposure control either. You just have to hit record using this dedicated button on the top here, point it in the right direction, and pray to the camera gods that it will get the exposure and autofocus correct. But if video is an absolute must for you, then after this model there were the NEX-F3 and the NEX-N3, which both offered 1080 HD capture and manual exposure controls to boot. Although these versions naturally fetch a slightly higher price online, they're both still very much affordable, and although it's no 4K video capture, which is the standard these days, the 1080p it captures will most likely be fine for social media content. So needless to say, this is very much a photography only camera. So how does it actually handle itself in terms of image quality? Well, just like any modern day Sony camera, the raw files generated by this old guy still very much hold up to 2024 standards. The flexibility of these files is surprisingly good, allowing you to push and pull the highlights and shadows around to bring back lost details without any real implications. Now, I'll be honest, the colors produced by older Sony cameras do tend to have a slight greenish tint to them, which I'm not a huge fan of. However, you can very easily fix this by using the tint slider, so it's really not a big deal once you know that. And once this has been corrected for, the end results look vibrant and true to life. Now, even though this is an older chip, you can still push the ISO fairly high without any noticeable levels of digital noise. In fact, I was getting usable shots up to around ISO 3200. After that point, you do start to notice noise creeping in, but really it's nothing the noise reduction tools in Lightroom can't fix. Although it's fair to say that this humble NEX-C3 can't compete with the super high-tech AI-driven autofocus systems and 4K video features we're accustomed to seeing on modern releases, at its core, this camera still provides a very solid foundation from which you can build your photography career, all wrapped into a pocketable package.